Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to the Psychology of Bilingualism and Multilingualism. I am Dr. Ark Verma from the Department of Cognitive Sciences at IIT Kanpur. In this lecture, I will continue talking about the bilingual and the multilingual brain. Now, some of the earliest advances in the localization of brain function were made when Paul Broca, a French physician, discovered a patient who was unable to speak at all, but his comprehension was relatively intact. This patient could at most say tan, tan, and tan. A post-mortem examination of the man's brain revealed that he has a lesion in the middle posterior part of the inferior frontal gyrus in the left hemisphere, which is basically referred to as the Brodmann's areas 44 and 45. This region came to be known as Broca's area, and the type of aphasia observed was referred to as Broca's aphasia. Remember from the previous lecture, difficulties in production or comprehension that are a result of brain damage are referred to as aphasias. And since this type of aphasia was first discovered by Paul Broca, this came to be known as Broca's aphasia. Now, an influential conceptualization of the language areas and their functions was actually offered by Lichtheim in 1885, wherein the Broca's and the Wernicke's areas were supposed to be connected with a conceptual center. Now, in this model, it was assumed that the Broca's areas actually stored the motor representation for words, whereas the Wernicke's areas are supposed to store the auditory forms of the words. Finally, the third center was the conceptual center, which was thought to store the conceptual representations of the words, which are sort of, in some sense, you can think about them as a pre-linguistic representations. Further, the auditory and the motor areas were supposed to be connected directly as well as indirectly through the conceptual center. Over the years, Lichtheim's model has been extremely influential in the research on aphasia, serving as an important theoretical framework for providing testable hypotheses about the causes and prognosis of different kinds of aphasia. For instance, damage to Broca's area is found to lead to a pattern of symptoms collectively known as Broca's aphasia, which actually include effortful, non-fluent and poorly articulated speech. Also, the speech of such patients was found to be telegraphic, that is, composed of simple and short utterances devoid of any kinds of grammatical markers or function words. For example, if I were a Broca's aphasic patient and I want to say I want to drink water, or let's say I want to drink water in a glass, I would probably say I drink water glass. And there will be no connecting grammatical rules between them, and there will be no function words that are, your articles and prepositions and conjunctions, which actually provide a connection between the basic content words that we typically see. Additionally, the comprehension of Broca's aphasics was also found to be deficient, with respect to grammatically complicated sentences. Their comprehension was relatively fine when you're talking about relatively simple utterances, but when you talk to them with grammatically sophisticated utterances, their comprehension was found to be wanting. On the other hand, Wernicke's aphasia is found to result in symptoms that include nonsensical speech along with severe problems in comprehension. Moreover, Lichtheim's model has actually served as a very interesting framework to account for other types of aphasias as well. For instance, when the arcuate fasciculus was found to be damaged, the resulting symptoms would be that people would have relatively good auditory comprehension, but they would be unable to repeat their speech. It was therefore attributed to, it was therefore referred to as conduction aphasia, because the area, connecting the Broca's and the Wernicke's area is damaged, and therefore the conduction is not possible. Or incidentally, if all three of these areas are damaged, the Broca's area, the Wernicke's area and the arcuate fasciculus, the disorder was referred to as global aphasia, which would basically mean that all aspects of linguistic performance are severely adversely affected. Now, while Lichtheim's model and early work from researchers like Broca and Wernicke actually threw light on some of the areas of brain involved in language functions, more recent research has actually unveiled a more complicated relationship between the language and the brain. For instance, research work has produced a substantial amount of evidence against the brain, against the so-called division of labor between Broca's and Wernicke's area for production and comprehension, respectively. In the same vein, Stowe, Havercott, and Swartz, in a seminal review, actually reported that while the involvement of the left inferior frontal gyrus, which is the Broca's area, and the superior temporal gyrus, which is the Wernicke's area, were indeed essential for language functioning, the hypothesis that the former supports language production and the latter supports language comprehension is not, very strongly supported by the evidence. Moreover, later research on the topic that has delved deeper into these questions has basically arrived at the conclusion that while these areas may not be exclusively responsible for language production and comprehension, they certainly play a very significant part in these functions. In a different direction, some researchers have actually proposed alternate hypotheses for the involvement of Broca's area and Wernicke's area in language. More specifically, it has been proposed that Broca's area subserves supporting of syntactic knowledge and processing, whereas Wernicke's area supports storage of word meaning knowledge and semantic processing. Now, indeed, research has shown that individuals that have Broca's aphasia have grammatically deficient speech output. Moreover, many of these patients actually find it difficult to understand sentences which require not only understanding of word meanings but also a sophisticated grammatical analysis of the input. Just as I was saying earlier, this seems to be in line with these newer hypotheses. Interestingly, neuroimaging studies have also yielded mixed results in this regard. For instance, few studies have shown that the syntactic analysis of the stimulus does not always recruit the Broca's area, or the semantic manipulations of stimulus material do not always activate the Broca's and the Wernicke's area together. Even in lesion studies, similar findings have emerged. For instance, patients deficient in the performance of morphosyntactic tasks have shown damage to both Wernicke's and Broca's areas instead of just the Broca's area. And on the other hand, some patients with the damage to Broca's area actually did not show severe deficiencies with morphosyntactic processing. So the assumption that we sort of started with in the 1800s that, as per Paul Broca, Broca's area is responsible for production of language and syntactic processing, and Wernicke's area is responsible for comprehension of language and semantic processing, is probably much more complicated as it appears on the outset. Also, it has been observed that patients with damage to Broca's area sometimes and who have shown deficiencies in morphosyntactic processing in particular tasks do not show the same deficiency in morphosyntactic processing across all types of tasks and different circumstances. Rather, these deficiencies show up only under very difficult circumstances. So these results altogether suggest that while the Broca's area might not actually be, the storage of syntactic knowledge as was originally assumed. Another important view about the function of the Broca's area was put forward by Stowe and colleagues, and following from research findings that have basically been coming up about the Broca's area, it supports that. It proposes that Broca's area actually supports some type of computation on knowledge units that are retrieved from other parts of the brain, and that it maintains these units for the duration these computations are performed. The view is akin to the view of a working memory kind of system, where we are basically saying is that the system takes information from the long-term memory and the short-term memory, performs, allows for some temporary manipulation to be happening on these stimuli, and typically functions as a work desk. Similarly, you can see that maybe Broca's area does not really store syntactic knowledge or anything, but it basically, derives meaning units from the long-term memory, and derives task demands from the current scenario, and basically manipulates that meaning inputs in using grammar. It sort of soothes them into a particular multi-word utterances so that it can meet the demands, communicative demands of a given scenario. An instance of such a position can actually be found in the research of Hagoot in 2005, who actually adopted a design-based approach to administering linguistic experiments and started laying out the various components of language use and mapping the brain regions that were responsible for these componential processes. Hagoot actually proposed that there might be three major components in language processing, which are memory, unification, and control, commonly referred together as the MUC network. Now, what do these terms actually mean? Hagoot basically says that memory refers to the information stored in the long-term memory, for instance, the knowledge about word forms and meanings stored in the mental lexicon. More interestingly, he proposes that the mental lexicon does not only store the word's meaning or its phonological and phonetic form, it also stores the so-called structural frames that allow for the grammatical analysis of sentences using these items. The idea is that once you are understanding a word, or let's say the way the information about a word is stored in the mental lexicon, it carries all types of information associated to that word, and once you have access to that information, you can very easily understand not only the word's meaning but also its syntactic function in a given sentence. Such a view has actually been referred to as the lexicalist view of language, that does not really assume a major distinction between lexical items on one hand and syntactic rules on the other. According to this view, all the grammatical information, including that for parsing of sentences, is actually stored in the mental lexicon itself, and that the component responsible for this is the memory component that is responsible for both retrieving this information and using it at the same time. Further, the term unification has actually been taken to refer to the process of integrating information received from the mental lexicon, including syntactic, semantic, or phonological information in the form of multi-word expression. So the component of unification, basically what it does, as I was saying, is that it brings together these informations about these words and actually integrates them into multi-word expression. So the integration or the unification part is done. Finally, the more important part, or a very important part, is the control component, which is assumed to be responsible to oversee whether the language system is operating in a manner that meets the communicative demands of the individual. Say, for example, whether the sentences are being constructed appropriately for a given communicative scenario. More precisely, in case of bilinguals, the control component would actually enable the bilingual to meet the demands of the communicative scenarios when, let's say, only one of the two languages are needed, or when both the languages are needed in a more flexible manner. Further, Hagoot actually tried to investigate the brain regions that would subserve these three hypothetical components, the memory, unification, and control. He pointed out to the left inferior frontal gyrus as the site for unification and localized the memory function in the large region in the left temporal lobe, also including Wernicke's area and Brodmann's area 38 and 21. Interestingly, the different subregions within the left inferior frontal gyrus actually appear to be specialized for unification of different types of information, both phonological, syntactic, and semantic information. Finally, Hagoot proposed that the control function is localized in the network for areas in the frontal cortex containing the ACC, that is the anterior cingulate cortex, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So here you can see that the three areas can be roughly mapped onto regions in the brain. Here you can see is the unification part, which is in the Broca's area, control part, which is in the frontal cortex, DLPFC and ACC, and the memory part, which is mainly in your temporal lobe. Now, the areas of the brain dedicated for the control function have also later been implicated in executive control functions that allow a bilingual to manage their dynamic communicative demands. The three regions involved in language functions have also been supported in recent reviews of neuroimaging work on language processing. So it seems that, to some extent, the MUC model put forward by Hagoot actually finds neuroscientific or neural imaging support as well. These results therefore confirm the importance of these regions for language use. However, depending upon the exact characteristics of task and stimulus materials, Utilized in these specific experiments, additional areas of the brain may also be executed. So it is not like just the three hypothetical regions and regions of the brain associated with them will only be activated in language functions. It is depends on the task demand, depends upon the communicative scenario as to which regions of the brain will be dynamically allocated for language functioning. Now, the other region of the brain that is supposed to be very, very important in language processing is a large region in the left temporal lobe that covers the areas assigned a memory function by Hagoot. And also the areas such as the vernix area, which was traditionally sort of assigned for comprehension. Now, these researchers actually propose that the left temporal lobe is committed to word retrieval, and also the different parts of this temporal lobe are actually specialized for retrieving different types of words. It probably has some bearing on the organization of concepts in the memory as well. To investigate this hypothesis, the authors actually presented a group of patients having lesions throughout the brain with a set of photographs showing faces of well-known people, animals or tools, and asked them to name the entities on these photographs. The performance of these patients was compared with that of a group of neurologically healthy people and the patients showing naming performance relative to this group. What did we find in the results? The results actually indicated that the naming deficit of these patients was not really caused by damage to conceptual knowledge, because the patients' responses clearly showed that they knew about these concepts. Say, for example, when they were presented with the picture of a skunk, they could actually describe the animal by saying, oh, that animal makes a terrible smell when you go close to it, it's black and white, it gets squashed on the road by cars a lot of times, and so on. Brain scans were subsequently made to locate the damaged region of the brain, and out of the 30 patients, 29 patients actually had damage to the left temporal lobe, thus indicating that word retrieval is indeed served by this particular area. Further, the scans actually revealed the exact site of the brain lesion was correlated with the specific types of word retrieval deficit. Now, see, this is something similar to, in some sense, localizing different kinds of conceptual knowledge to different regions in the brain, and therefore I would request you to take this with a pinch of salt, because there are obviously theories about localized regions in the brain for particular concepts, and there is a contrary theory that says the concepts are distributed across the brain. In our context, we are just going through these studies, but we will sort of try and take them with a pinch of salt and address them as we go further. Now, patients, just to sort of recount the results that they found in the study, patients with lesion in the anterior part of the left temporal lobe, the temporal pole that is, exhibited impaired naming of persons. Those with a lesion in the middle of the left inferior temporal gyrus showed impaired naming of animals. Finally, those with lesions in the posterior part of the left inferior and middle and superior temporal gyri were actually impaired in naming tools. A subsequent PET study with neurologically intact individuals also corroborated the results of the present study. So, yes, the evidence is there for a certain degree of localization of particular concepts in the region of the temporal lobe. However, there are other studies also which I have discussed earlier in the course on Introduction to Psychology of Language. The more dominant or the more popular sense is that this is more distributed rather than localized to different areas of the brain. All in all, the three left temporal areas that Damasio and colleagues actually showed to be involved in word retrieval actually largely coincide with the areas that subserve the memory component in Hagoot's model, albeit these areas serve a slightly different function in the model. According to Damasio, the three regions that they have delineated were actually intermediary regions rather than, that they, in the sense that they do not contain the names of persons, animals, and tools. Rather, they contain knowledge about how to reconstruct these names from a distributed network. Alright, so this is again something that you can see that there is a bit of a conflict between studies, but the more predominant view is that the knowledge about concepts is more distributed in the brain, and these regions that Hagoot is finding or Damasio is finding is actually regions that are coordinating the collection of these information rather than storing these information at themselves. Another interesting illustration of the diversity of views on the functions of the classical language areas, Broca's, Wernicke's, and the archaic fasciculars, in the left hemisphere concerns the divide between declarative or procedural memory, which was developed by Ullmann and colleagues. Now, as per this model, there is certainly a difference in the types of memory function that is involved in the learning, representation, and use of facts and events on one hand, that is declarative memory, and the memory involved in learning and control of motor and cognitive skills and habits, that is your procedural memory. According to Ullmann, lexical knowledge, that is knowledge of the sounds and meanings of words, can actually be considered as a part of declarative memory, and hence will primarily be taken care of by the temporal lobe, whereas including the Wernicke's area, whereas aspects of procedural memory basically are rooted in left frontal structures and the basal ganglia. So basically what we are seeing is that the distribution is not in terms of specific types of concepts, but the specific way in which these concepts are actually acquired, whether they are acquired as facts and stored in a place, whether these are acquired as skills and stored in a different place. Now, an interesting suggestion made by Ullmann concerning bilinguals was that a dysfunction of the procedural memory can actually be compensated by increased dependence on declarative memory, in the sense that the linguistic structures that are normally computed using the procedural system are actually memorized by the declarative memory. Basically, what we are trying to say is that if you are a bilingual and you are trying to pick up a second language, it will obviously be difficult for you to grasp the grammar of the language and hence learn it in a procedural manner. So what happens is, at least in the initial stages, the individual or yourself will rely more heavily on the declarative memory, basically the mapping between the words of language 1 and language 2, and basically a lot of this task will be done by declarative memory, whereas for L1 a lot of this task would actually be taken care of by the procedural memory. Ullmann actually went ahead and proposed that languages that are acquired later in life in the two memory systems actually play a different role than in L1, because later exposure to languages may actually impair the ability of the procedural memory to grasp these rules. Typically what would happen is that linguistic forms that are computed grammatically in the procedural memory for L1 depend largely on declarative or lexical memory in L2. This is precisely what I was trying to tell you a moment ago. The later the age of L2 exposure, the larger the role of declarative memory and the lesser the role of grammatical processing or procedural memory. Now, this was a bit about how languages are organized in the left hemisphere. Let us read a little bit about right hemisphere involvement in language as well. Now, we have seen so far that the areas of the brain implicated in language processing are mainly in the left hemisphere. This basically underlines the view that has been known as the language lateralization view, which believes that language is entirely and exclusively lateralized to the left hemisphere. Now, while there are a range of studies that have shown that different areas in the left hemisphere are implicated in language processing, the right hemisphere has also been implicated in specific types of language processing. For instance, Tan and colleagues actually show that several areas of the right hemisphere are strongly activated during the processing of logographic Chinese characters. Now, just a bit about logographic Chinese characters, because they have a much more visual-spatial component than alphabets in English or Hindi for that matter even. It is expected that given that right hemisphere is adept at visual-spatial processing, decoding or deciphering Chinese logographic characters would take help from the right hemisphere in solving this task. Further, Stowe and colleagues also report that the right hemisphere is implicated in the processing of lexically ambiguous words and indirect forms of languages such as metaphors, irony, etc. These findings suggest that the right hemisphere can actually provide an alternative interpretation when initially constructed grammatical meanings turn out to be incompatible with the contextual information. Now, this has led to some kind of an alternative hypothesis about the role of right hemisphere in language processing, by basically saying that the right hemisphere is typically recruited when there is some reason or a higher processing demand is surfaced. Support for this computational load account of the right hemisphere involvement in language processing also comes from an account of special populations. Say, for example, the elderly people for whom most of the language tasks would be more effortful, schizophrenics, or even bilinguals, where the typical task of managing a language is much more than it is in normal developing monolinguals. So that is why you will see, and you can expect that lateralization of bilinguals would be slightly more bilateral as opposed to exclusively unilateral or left hemispheric in most monolinguals. So this is what I wanted to sort of talk to you about in this lecture. I'll meet you in the next lecture with more about language lateralization in bilinguals. Thank you.